Well, I think one of the most important elements to your work is facilitating conservation efforts. And by putting a Band-Aid on the issues, just by saying, it's a result of global warming or it's all the cause of CO2, just sounds like it would undermine the very thing that, you're trying to uphold, which is, conservation efforts. And it seems to me by making this a global issue, it then becomes the public's issue or our issue to solve as a global phenomenon rather than a local phenomenon, which can be solved on the local level with the resolution being right there in front of us.
Absolutely. I mean, we do have the power to fix things locally, but when you make it a global thing, it's overwhelming. And sort of that's what a government that wants to have the power, that's what you do. Say, I have the power because, I'm controlling things on this global level, which is why they're doing this in Glasgow. You have these IPCC meetings. And I didn't write about wildfires in my book, but I've been blogging about it. Our field station almost got taken out by a wildfire. It was arson. Maybe 20% of the fires in California are arson. So that's one issue. If you, the one thing you can do, if you teach people how to have a defensible space, you clear out the shrubs. You have natural fire breaks. And when we suppress fires, we stop natural fire breaks. Instead of having a mosaic of forest and open land, that's all grown over. And the other issue we've had is because the way grazing introduced these annual grasses that they dry out in an hour. So climate change has nothing to do with it. You have one good warm, hot day and they're highly flammable. And then if you look at when ignitions happen, natural ignitions were like July and August from lightning. And then human ignitions, which cause 84 to 90% of all the fires, most of them happen more during the winter months when it's colder. And so most of this increase in fires because people have expanded into the wildland, the populations have increased, so you have a greater chance of stupid. So we had a big fire, the rim fire around Yosemite. It was a campfire that got away. In the second biggest fire happened in Mendocino County, and the maximum temperatures there were warmer in the 30s, had nothing to do with global warming, but it was started in a grassland. A farmer was driving a stake, hit a rock, had a spark. That was enough to get the grass going.
Wow.
So these large grassland fire, well, they say it's the biggest fire. Well, they don't tell you how much is forest, how much is shrub, how much is grass. But the grass also, it's like if you want to start a campfire, you don't hold a match under a log. That's not going to work. You need kindling. So these grasses and small twigs are your kindling. And when you let that grow up, then you've created all this kindling to start more fires and act like a fuse that brings it into the forest. So that it's managing the forest is the number one thing that we could do. Get rid of some of those perennial grasses. The PG&E did some bad stuff where a lot of them have been ignited. The deadliest fire that was up at Paradise near Chico, that was started by, and I went up and visited right after, and you could see where it spread from where that ignition happened. So where those are in danger, you got to make sure the trees are trimmed back or you put it underground. But, as people have spread out, you have more of an electrical grid, so you have more problems that way. But they say, but people just go, it's climate change. I go, and I have one guy around near my field station who's just insane that just to protect himself, he has to limit his carbon emissions or his house is going to burn down. I said, we can go to net zero and your house will still burn down because number one, people are making these ignitions. Number two, you're surrounded by all these shrubs and grasses that go right up to your house. When I looked at the Paradise Fire, there were some places that were just totally demolished, and you could see it was a ground fire, got to a house, and then one house radiated enough heat to ignite the next house. The trees around it didn't even have the leaves burnt. It was the fuels on the ground that carried it. There was a couple of churches that were serving, food and help to people, and they had manicured lawns around it. You could see the fire went up to the lawn. It scarred the trees outside, but it never passed the lawn. And so those houses were still as deadly as that fire was, there were places that weren't touched because they had the right configuration of ground cover that wasn't going to allow the fire to spread. But if you don't deal with that, you're going to have more devastating fires. But it's the height of insanity to me, and it's almost criminal to be blaming CO2 when we could locally, as we say, we could do better ground fuel management. We could try to do stuff to minimize human ignitions. You're not going to be able to stop arson, except for maybe more surveillance. But you never know what the rigs are going to do. Kind of the one that came near our field station was sort of out in the backcountry. He lit it.
Wow.
So it bothers me greatly that what we could do to make a more resilient environment, and is what I've spent my life trying to make people aware of. Mm-hmm. People are looking at, well, CO2 is the real problem, and it's the least of the problems, the very least of the problems.
Interesting. How frustrating. Well, even with drought, as a California native, every year we hear, there's a drought in California, and then our water bill goes up $200 or $300.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of misconception related to California's drought problems. And one of them is, which they say is rising CO2 levels as the cause. Can you give an alternate explanation to this? And
I've done so, and I will.
Yeah.
But number one, what you realize in California more than probably any other place is El Niños and La Niñas affect you greatly. When you have a La Niña, it blocks the flow of moisture to the California coast. And California is a Mediterranean climate, so in the summer you don't get any rain. By June, all the rains stop, and you don't get them until September. Late October, we now had some rains. So you have that summer drought anyways. And if you know the botany, most of the plants are geared to fire because you have these droughts, and they're geared to drought. When we fixed the watershed, we were looking at, you can look at sediments and other factors about what would cause drought. And you see there were times when there was a 100-year drought in California. It's the way these pressure systems set up in the ocean where they allow water to come, bring rainfall to the land or not. And we're already in a very susceptible area where you have this Mediterranean climate where it's going to dry out. And you see the same thing in the Mediterranean, down in Chile, down in Africa. It's the way this kind of symmetrical placement of these high pressure systems that control it. And then if what they say, well, if you look at rainfall and you look at, we have blue oaks. I don't know if there is sort of a foothill. You don't use the tree rings for temperature because they're low, but you use them for sensitivity to rainfall because they're very sensitive. They grow more when you get good rainfall. Well, you look 300-400 years, there's no trend whatsoever. You have 3 times a century, you have very dry periods. 3 times a century, you have very wet periods. You have stuff in the middle. So that you call a meteorological drought. And because there's no trend, the people that want to push a climate crisis say, well, we were looking at a agricultural drought, or they'll call it a hydrological drought. But they use that, and they use something called the Palmer Drought Index. And what that does, it looks at how much rainfall, and then they add temperature to it to kind of multiply the effect. And if you have a warmer temperature, then they say, see, global warming is causing more dryness. But the thing is, when you dry out the land, you increase the temperature. You can flip cause and effect very easily. And most of the time, higher temperatures have been due to the way we've dried out the land. But then that gets used to multiply and say, oh, look, it's warming is causing this drought, when it's really the opposite way around. The drought has caused the warming. And I can show that in a number of different places where weather stations have been affected by dryness around them. And the urban heat effect is partly due to an urban drought. The surfaces don't have the moisture to absorb the heat anymore. So it goes right into raising the surface or the air temperature.
Interesting.
But it fits the narrative. You have you show a little globe with flames coming out of it to say the world's on fire, and of course that's going to dry out the land, and it makes sense. It's easy for people to say, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's the visual.
I mean, and I just saw it with the restoration work we did. You know, you had this hot, dry meadow that turned into cooler and wetter because you fixed the way the streams flowed, and they kept the water table better. So, but you know, I don't get the attention that Greta does because she's an actress. So,
Jeez.
kind of hurts my feelings a little, but I'm man enough to take it. So
yeah, exactly. Well, I have one final question, which to some might be the most important one. You know, you mentioned, we talked about this a little bit earlier, you know, that we should always question authority, and your generation specifically had, you know, that mantra that said to always question authority, which I was always taught that in school as well when I was growing up. But like we were saying before, we live in a world now that seems to demonize people that question authority or provide an alternate way of thinking about something. And a quote in your book by Robert Bolton says that a belief is not merely an idea that the mind possesses, it's an idea that possesses the mind. You know, scientists, like anyone, can be blinded by their own beliefs, but how do you separate your own beliefs from the truth?
Well, you know, when I see another paper that says it's due to CO2, you know, I get a little shook, and I read it, and I try to look at what they're doing, and you know, I really try to question myself all the time. And part of what my energy into the book was not just to claim to discredit the CO2 theory, but was, let me first look at the natural factors. And if we can identify how the environment changes naturally, and get a good sense of that, and then we can use that as the control. And then when you have something that happens on top of that, then CO2 could be a candidate for that cause. And so most of my efforts have been, how do I understand natural change? But I had submitted something to a local newspaper. They used to print my stuff, but then a new owner came in who was a little far left. He said, all you're saying is it's not CO2. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm saying it's natural climate change, and this is how it works. But they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to know, you know, he said, well, you're a minority opinion. I said, well, you know,
I mean,
not everybody thinks alike. So
yeah.
How do you judge what I'm saying is right? Well, you use that, and you have that as your working hypothesis, and see how things mesh out. And a lot of things, you know, they said, you know, with the polar bears, you know, they're going to suffer because we're going to be ice free. And they were first saying 2012 and 2018. People like Michael Mann and Ken Caldera said, you know, we think you could be ice free by 2030 and maybe even sooner. And those predictions just aren't going to happen. But will probably happen. And I've actually bet with a few physicists that by 2030, we'll start to see Arctic sea ice come back. And I make that bet because of looking at cycles that we know through fisheries, how much warm water has gone into the Arctic, is warm Greenland, they cooled again, they gone back again. So I see all these cycles that, you know, I might be off by a decade on this, but I really feel it's how much water goes in that's warm and it gets trapped underneath the ice. And then when the ice leaves, all this heat comes. And so if you look at these maps, the Arctic is what's causing the global average to get twice, it's twice the average because the Arctic is biasing it that way. They did studies in the 50s through the 90s over where the western part of the Arctic was covered. And this was in Nature, it was top journal. And they did, instead of weather balloons, you get on the ice and you let it up, you fly over and drop them. And then the Russians had floating weather stations going on, and they compiled all that data and said, there's no warming here. We don't see any warming. It's because the ice insulates it. It doesn't allow it. Well, once the wind blows the ice out, and a lot of the ice that left the Arctic in the 90s in early 2000s was due to winds, not due to melting. It melted out in the Atlantic once it was blown out past
Wow.
past Greenland. So it's
There's all different explanations that have to do with landscapes and cycles, and
that's why I try to push. And you see, I like to think I'm right about everything, but I know that's not going to happen. So it's my sincere attempt to try to look at all these natural issues, all these landscape issues, and see how it squares with, you know, what we call these radiative effects of carbon dioxide. And so, you know, and again, I think, if you know what I mean by an atmospheric inversion, if you've gone through orchards and vineyards and you see these big propellers on the side of the vineyards, that's because when it's going to get cold enough, it will damage their crops. So they put the propellers to draw warmer air down to the colder surface. And the reason is the surface cools much quicker than the air does. 99% of the air is oxygen and nitrogen that's been heated because it hit the warm surface, and it can't lose that heat until it bumps into CO2. And then CO2 can radiate it away.
oh,
But there's so little CO2 or so little water to help radiate that heat away that it takes a lot longer for the air to cool. And so farmers have learned to take advantage of this. So say the air is staying warm up here, let's bring it down to the surface to keep our crops from growing. So in a way, if you had more CO2, you would allow more cooling. As much as it causes a greenhouse effect, it also has a cooling effect. And that is not, well, you don't see people ever talking about that. You only see the warming effect. They don't balance that out. So there's, you know, I did a video trying to talk about that. Man, I said how CO2 saved the world. I think I titled it, but you know, there's so much imbalance with this, and there's so much lack of natural understanding that it's all political. And they've just done a good job of shutting up skeptics who are saying, hey, look at these natural factors, and call you a denier. And that makes people, there was I didn't put it in the book, but it was a quote, I'm telling you, it's a science fiction writer. So you don't have to burn books to control what people are thinking. You just have to make them not want to read it.
Oh my gosh.
And that's really what's been going on the last 20 years with this whole climate agenda, is label everybody as deniers, label them as white supremacists, racists, because they don't believe this, or make them anti-scientists. So whatever they say, you just turn away. And I see people, they won't even think twice about what you say, no matter how much experience. They just, oh, you disagree, so I don't want to listen. And that's the scary part to me.